fixing a broken recycling system by our own Peter. So we're really glad to have you here, Peter. And by the look of the attendance, I got somebody that I can't get to for some reason. There we go. All right. Anyway, at that rate, Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Oh, it's good to see everybody, but I don't see, unfortunately, I don't see many of the faces yet, but I certainly see a bunch of names I recognize. So I'm Peter Spendelow. Just for introduction, I was the president of Northwest Fed for about a decade, and I'm still involved. I still am coordinating, for instance, our health conference, which is happening in May this year. We're going to bring our health conference back, and it's going to be a combination of in-person and online. People can attend online or they can attend in person. So that's going to be exciting. And but I've been really working, really busy with my work at Department of Environmental Quality. I've been at DEQ since 1985, working on recycling issues. And there's a lot going on now. So let me just jump right into the presentation, because again, there's a lot. I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides here. So, so first of all, let's see, pardon me, get my glasses back on so I can see which one I want. Here we go. I think this is it. Is this the standard slide? Oops, you're muted, John. So you can see it? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, so, oops, except for I'm not beginning here. Okay, why is, here we go. There we go. Okay, so again, you heard from John the title, Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, Fixing a Broken System. But let's start out about how we got to where we are, how, what is broken on the system. Oregon was one of the first states, it was the first state in the nation to really emphasize recycling and have a law that basically required that curbside recycling be provided to everybody, that some sort of opportunity to recycle be provided to everybody in the state, including for if you live in a city of over 4,000, you would get curbside recycling. And so, but when we first started out, we really didn't know that much about how to do it. And we collected all materials separately, which produced very nice, clean materials. And what this slide's in here mainly to show is that cute little truck that was Sanipack operated, where they had separate compartments for every material. So you put out your material with your glass in one bag, maybe color sorted glass even, and your tin cans here, and your newspaper there, and your cardboard there. And the collector would get out of their truck, come over, pick up your stuff, and pull each bag out separately and dump it in the right compartment. It made for really nice, clean material. But it was not very convenient for the public because you had to keep all this stuff separate and figure out how to hold on to it and then get it out there. So what we found, though, is that over time we switched how we collected things to use large roll carts, and we collect a lot more material now than we did back then. If you look back to what we collected then, in Oregon at least, it was basically newspaper, cardboard, glass, tin cans, and aluminum. And you'll notice there's no plastic on there at all. We did not collect plastic in our curbside programs back then. But now there is quite a bit of plastic in the Portland metro area, at least, and I believe up there in Clark County. You can collect bottles of all types. You can collect tubs, and things like buckets and so on are all materials you can put in your curbside bin, as well as a lot of scrap paper that we didn't recycle back in the past, because the technology has improved where people can figure out how to use that scrap paper, for instance, to make a lot of products that they didn't really know how to do back in the past. So we've seen a lot of expansion on what is collected. And as I mentioned before, what we did was we moved to commingling all the materials and giving people large containers, carts that are like 60 to 90 gallons, giving them plenty of space to put that material into the into the bins, because when they had these small bins, frequently people would fill those up and then they just start putting the rest of the stuff in the garbage can because they didn't have any space in the small bin. So the large bins have been great for increasing the amount of recycling. But unfortunately, they've also increased the amount of contamination, and that's based on two sources. One is that when you have a big cart, there's a tendency to want to fill it. And if you got something, you say, I wonder if this is recyclable. Well, I'm going to put it in the cart and they'll figure it out. And that's what we call wishful recycling. And usually that material is not recyclable. We see things like garden hoses in there, for instance, and there's no way that you can figure out how to use garden hoses to make new products that I can think of in any sort of a commodity way. So we got that. And then there's another problem that comes with commingling, and that is you've got to sort the material out. And sometimes that is not as easy as it sounds, that bottles get flattened and they act like paper as they're going through the machines. And so you end up with a lot of plastic ending up in the paper. I wanted to just give you an idea, though, when we moved to these large roll carts, this was over a space of a few years from about 2003 up until about 2010. And the green line on the top is the recycling rate for rigid plastic containers in Oregon. And you can see it just really climbed over that period. Providing people with large carts meant that they were much more willing to recycle their plastic than they were in the past. So anyway, but again, as I mentioned before, these carts had problems in that they had a lot of garbage. So you can see that, in this slide, the roll carts had significantly more recyclables in them than the bins did, and that's good recyclables, not counting the contamination. But they also had over 3 times as much contaminants in those bins as in the roll carts as you had back when we're just using these smaller bins for collecting materials. So that's continued. We still have about 9% contamination in at least in the Portland metro area program. So we're going to be doing a study to measure that again shortly. But every time we've done it, we've been somewhere around that 9% figure in those large roll carts. So, oopsie, I think I went the wrong way here. So anyway, we are collecting plastics now. I mentioned we're collecting things like buckets and so on. And this is what happens to those materials when you put them in. This is what happens to the materials that are supposed to be in the bins. And that includes things like milk jugs, PET bottles. They get recycled back into products that are much like what they are. Usually not milk jugs back in milk jugs, but milk jugs into other plastic products. But when you get to things like tubs and pails and so on, those were a lot harder to sort. And so back in the past, like 5-7 years ago, what our processors would simply do was take all those materials and they would load them all up together, all these mixed plastics, and they would send them off to Asia. We didn't have any processors west of the Mississippi who could take that mixture of plastics and sort it all into the proper resins. And the reason why we didn't is because up until about 2018, there were buyers in Asia, mainly in China, who were willing to come here and pay for that mixed plastic, pay for even dirty stuff, because they had cheap labor back there. And we were just happy to have that plastic being recycled, and we kind of looked the other way. We didn't really, and I was guilty of this too, not really looking at what was happening to that material. But to give you an idea how dirty it is, this is a slide showing the amount of pulper rejects out of a big paper plant up in Longview, Washington, the Norpac paper plant. They would buy recycled paper. They would pay good money for it, like $150 a ton or something like that. And they would take that paper and they'd feed it into their pulper, where it pulps up the newspaper and the other fibers and makes a nice pulp that then they can run it into their machines and use that to make new paper. They de-ink it and clean it up some, but they run it into new paper. And you can see back in around year 2000, the level of contamination, the stuff which is not pulpable, that falls out of of their system at the end because it's not pulpable, was very small. It was only like about 1%. But over the years, it grew and grew and grew as more and more programs switched to commingled collection with large roll carts. The contamination level just really went up to the point where about 10 years ago, it got so high that Norpac pretty much stopped buying paper because they were paying all this money for the paper, and then they're having to turn around and pay for the disposal of a lot of stuff that was in the paper that didn't belong there. And to give you an idea what that stuff is, let me just show you. This is what it's a drum pulper, and up the back of the pulper, you can see these milk jugs and aluminum cans and all sorts of other garbage Now, this is stuff that was in the paper that we were sending to our paper mill here in Oregon. And so that they stopped buying our material because this stuff was just too dirty. But then we ran into another problem, and that is that Oregon was a really big paper making state. We had 2 large mills that would make newspaper, for instance, out of old paper. They bought, lots and lots of paper, but with the increasing level of contamination and with the decline in newspaper consumption, that people just aren't reading the newspaper like they were, both of these mills closed. One closed back in 2011, another one closed in 2015. And one of the other reasons why they closed is because they were having trouble getting enough paper, because Asian buyers were still willing to come over here and buy our paper, even though it was so highly contaminated. They were still willing to pay high prices for it because they could sort it out there at cheaper prices than we would. Well, that's what the businesses were doing. But what we found out later was that was not really what was good. China, the government finally stepped in and said, we are tired of all of the rest of the world shipping their garbage to us in the paper that they send and in the plastic that they send. And they just said, we're not going to take it anymore. And they banned the imports of unsorted material or poorly sorted material from the rest of the world. And so if you want to recycle plastic with them, you have to first really process it and make pellets and something that they can put directly into their molding machines. They're not going to buy mixed plastics anymore. And the reason they're not going to buy it is because, well, first of all, this is the sort of conditions that people were sorting in. It's pretty awful conditions. And this is from a documentary called Plastics China that documents the problems of the stuff that the rest of the world was inflicting on China, and that the business people were willing to buy, but was causing problems to the public. Because you see here, this is actually from another part of Asia. After China stopped taking our material pretty much in 2018. And so it started going to other Asian countries. And you'd see stuff like this, where they would get all this plastic in and they would pull out the stuff that they could use. And then everything else, they don't have the solid waste management system that we have here with nice landfills and transfer stations and a way to get the garbage there. They just end up piling the stuff out in the field and maybe torching it off once in a while, or maybe it would end up blowing into the ocean. And it's not just the plastic that we were sending them that was a problem. It was the paper we were sending them. Just as you saw from that NORPAC slide that I showed before, a lot of plastic was going over to Asia in our paper. And this was what was ending up, this sort of thing is what was ending up with that also. So they put strong restrictions on it. As I mentioned before, no unsorted paper, no more than 0.5% contamination in anything. And they've since even gotten stricter than this. And what did that do to our recycling here? Well, as you can imagine, when we had all this material going to Asian markets and are paying top dollar, and all of a sudden they just cut it off, cold turkey. That just caused the whole market for recycling to drop. We didn't have the end users here who were using the plastics, for instance, and the paper too was a real problem. And our mills would not take this dirty material as they were willing to take in China. So you had the prices for recycled material that the buyers would spend just plummeted. It used to be that the haulers here would get paid somewhere around $50 to $100 a ton for dropping off their recyclables. And that just reversed to where they were now having to pay that amount to drop off their recyclables. They're sometimes having to pay about the same amount as if they took it to a landfill and dumped it there, because it's about $100 a ton to dump garbage in the Portland metro area, for instance. And then the processors themselves had problems. They had to really slow down their lines so they could clean up the material better and meet the sort of standards that paper mills here were meeting. And as a result, they just couldn't take in material as fast as they could. And your plant up there in Clark County in Vancouver was really they really had problems. They ended up cutting off a lot of suppliers, including a lot of suppliers from Oregon. They simply told all the suppliers down in the Eugene area that weren't their own company that they would no longer take the material, leaving our recyclers here high and dry, not knowing what to do with the material. And as a result, we had some really bad consequences. We ended up with having to dispose of about 17,000 tons of source separated recycled material, stuff that people properly put in their bins, but it couldn't get sorted at those facilities or couldn't get sorted fast enough, or its price was so bad that that the haulers just wouldn't take it there. And over the space of about a year and a half, we disposed of 17,000 tons of good recyclables that way. That's only a small fraction of the total recycling we're doing, but still, it really hurts me to see that sort of waste happening. And in order to pay for the cost of slowing down those processing so that they clean it up better, and having to pay, not getting the money for the recycling like you used to, most of the households in the Portland metro area, and I believe up there too, saw rate increases, $2 to $3 a month increase in the garbage rate in order to pay for this additional cost of recycling. That recycling is now being a real cost, a money loser rather than getting some revenue from it. And we saw a whole lot of articles about the problems we were seeing all throughout the state with you're doing it wrong, talking about the contamination level of what we have in our recycling. So what was the impact of that? Well, I don't think you really had any impact there in Clark County. And I know in the Portland metro area that they were unchanged what they collect. But as I mentioned before, down in Eugene, a lot of those a lot of the collectors no longer had a place to take the material. And so they had to go to a paper mill to take it, which meant they had to stop taking plastics because that paper mill didn't want plastics down there. And the rest of the state pretty much followed along, and they at least dropped some of their plastics. They dropped the stuff which was hardest to recycle, the stuff that used to be sent to Asia, like the pails and the tubs and those sorts of things. They continued to recycle the milk jugs because those still fetched a good price, and the soft drink bottles and water bottles. But the other types of plastics, generally, a lot of the state dropped collection of them. So that's where we're talking about the broken system. That we were sending a lot of stuff to Asia that was just causing environmental problems there. We didn't have an infrastructure here to handle the material ourselves. We didn't have any way for us, the regulators, to make sure that the recycling being collected went to a proper market. So anyway, those were the sorts of problems. So we ended up doing a long-term planning process, and we eventually formed what we called the Recycling Steering Committee that met over a couple of years. We hired a facilitator to work with us, and we hired some really good contractors to help us model what we should be doing. What if we did certain things, what would be the impact of that? And amazingly, well, let me just get to that in a moment. Actually, let me just jump past here. We ended up adopting in one session what we call the Oregon Recycling Modernization Act, or Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, to give it its full title, Senate Bill 582. And this is really amazing for a state to adopt legislation the first time around. What I am used to is you take legislation to like the bottle bill happened this way. They first took the Oregon bottle bill to the legislature in 1969. It got a hearing, it came out of committee, but it didn't go beyond that. And so they came back in 1971, and that's when they passed it. That's the normal thing, is you take a couple of shots at it to improve it. So you come in there with an idea and you improve it. But we put so much effort into planning out what we needed and getting the feedback and so on, that the legislature was willing to go ahead and pass this thing on the first shot. And we had a lot of support from a lot of different parties to do that. But, and ours and Maine's were the first two bills to do this type of law. It's called product stewardship, or producer responsibility. Up until now, the producers of packaging and printed paper, they produce it, you'd buy it, but the producers no longer had any role in what happens to the material afterwards. And that means, for instance, they could make packaging that is difficult to recycle because they didn't care. If you bought it, it was out of their hands. But what we want to do is put some of the responsibility back on the producers of this material, so they would have incentives to do the proper thing. So they wouldn't, for instance, put polyvinyl chloride labels on a PET plastic bottle, because those two types of plastics are completely incompatible and would destroy the ability to recycle the plastic bottles. So And so both Maine and Oregon adopted this type of legislation last year. But this isn't new stuff. Throughout Canada, throughout Europe, this is common. That all these, many of the Canadian provinces and the European Union all have product stewardship laws of this nature that make the producers responsible for even providing the full recycling collection system, including the collection trucks and everything that they'll pay for. And in some cases they run, like in British Columbia, they operate a bunch of the recycling collection trucks, and they operate all of the processing facilities. And if they don't operate a recycling collection truck, they're paying the municipality for the costs of doing that. So that's the sort of laws that we have. Oregon's law ended up being somewhat different from that, but we still put major responsibilities on the producers. So this is how it will work. It involves the people who produce any sort of packaging, any sort of printed paper, and also food serviceware, things like forks and knives and plates and cups and stuff like that. They are now the individual producers themselves, all of them. If they sell this material into Oregon and they don't meet one of the exemptions, they are responsible for doing a lot of things. But for each company to do that just wouldn't work. So what our law requires is that they all join together to form one or more what we call producer responsibility organizations, or PROs. They will pay money to the producer responsibility organization based on things like what their sales are here in Oregon. And then the PRO is responsible for actually implementing the requirements of the law. And so some of the requirements are, for instance, some of the improvements we're going to see is we are going to see in Oregon a statewide recycling collection list, which is identical throughout the state. No longer will you have down in Eugene where they don't collect certain types of plastics, and Medford where they even drop mixed paper, for instance. We're going to see the same list of materials throughout the state. And the producers are going to help pay for that to make that happen. They're going to pay the extra costs that it takes to make this happen. We're going to see expansion of recycling collection services that currently are, we have recycling in the cities of over 4,000 population and in a number of the smaller cities. But if you go out there to Eastern Oregon, there are many large areas, including some fairly large cities, Hermiston, Baker City, that don't have a full curbside program like we do here. Pendleton's another one that just has very limited curbside collection. So we're going to see those programs expand to take the full list that we take here. And we're going to see a whole lot of education about recycling and contamination reduction, ways to try to get that contamination out so that the public doesn't put as much in there. But where Oregon's law is really aimed at more is what happens to material after you collect it. We want to make sure that the material processors are doing a good job of cleaning up that material and sending it off to what we call responsible end markets. These are end markets where they can properly take care of any contamination that's still in there and where they are using that material for a very productive purpose. We do not want to see this material going to Malaysia and having the sort of thing what we saw in the past where they'll sort out the plastics they don't want and they'll just leave them out there. And maybe they'll wash into the ocean and become marine debris coming back to us. So between the processors, we're going to require the processors all to meet certain standards. The ones in Oregon are going to have permits. If they're processors outside the state who want to take Oregon material, they'll have to meet standards and be certified to meet standards that we will be adopting. And they'll be the same sort of standards that our own in-state ones will be doing. And we'll have both the producers and the processors be responsible for making sure that the material goes to a responsible end market. And my agency is going to be the one overseeing all this. And if anybody's looking for a job in this field, we're going to be hiring a bunch of people because we're going to be adding about 5 staff over the next couple of years to do this work, because it's going to be a big job taking this on. Some of the other things we're going to see are, in addition to, so in Oregon at least, excuse me, let me backtrack. In Oregon at least, we're still using the same collection system for recycling that we already have. It's a good system. Our garbage haulers who are providing recycling services are doing a good job out there. They're very efficient. They're pretty efficient in how they do it. So we are going to have them continue to do the collection, and the producers are going to mainly be dealing with making sure the material is processed properly and gets to the end market, and also providing some backstops to making sure that we don't run into a problem if we have markets dry up on us like they did back in 2018. The producers are going to be responsible for paying the extra cost. So it will not fall back on the public, and we won't have programs dropping their recycling in order to, because it just costs too much money. But the producers also will be adding in certain materials that we figure they would be the best ones to collect that don't belong in your commingled recycling bin. Things like plastic bags, for instance. We do not want plastic bags in our commingled recycling. They act like paper, they get tangled up in the machineries, they jam stuff up, and then they make it so the other material doesn't sort properly because they've jammed up the holes that the containers are supposed to fall through. So all those containers end up going down the line with the paper. So we do not want stuff like that. We don't want stuff like hoses or anything which is they call tanglers that just wrap around the equipment and cause problems. So things like plastic bags, things like textiles are in that list of things that we might have producer collected, although textiles won't be under this program because they're not a packaging. But the plastic bags certainly are. We could see a bunch of other types of materials go there too. We have goals for plastic packaging now, where these goals will go up to 50% by the year 2040, which honestly, I think we're probably going to have difficulty meeting that, but that's what the legislature set, and we'll see how we can do on that. I'm not sure I'm still going to be at DEQ when that happens, but we'll see. I mentioned more about the recycling end markets, and then I also mentioned about how the producers will be funding programs that will protect Oregon households and businesses from higher costs. That one thing they'll be doing, for instance, is when we're adding these new programs, collecting materials out in rural areas, the producers will be paying the cost of transporting those materials back to the Portland area, which is where all the processors are. So this is going to make it a lot easier for recycling out there in Baker City and Hermiston and places like that, because they won't have to figure out how to pay to ship something 300 miles to get to a market that may not pay them for it at all. So anyway, and here we go. Some other important elements of our law is we're going to be doing a bunch of studies. We're going to be looking at multifamily recycling, how we can improve that. We're going to be looking at equity, how to make things fairer for everybody, including we really concentrate on the workers at the processing facilities, because if you know that job, that is an awful job. If you can imagine standing there in one place, picking out every milk jug as it comes by, or picking out every piece of garbage that shouldn't be in the recycling. That's the sort of job these people have. It's a repetitive motion injury type of job. It's dirty, it's loud. It's not a job that people want. We want to make sure those workers get fair living wages and also that they have decent conditions to work in. We want to make sure that there's truth in labeling on recycling, because one of the problems that people have identified is that a bunch of plastics that have that nice recycling logo with the number in it, tell you what type of plastic it is, things like polyvinyl chloride, number 3 plastic, is not acceptable in recycling programs. We don't get enough of it to recycle, and if we did get it even, it's a real problem when polyvinyl chloride and PET plastic mix. They just are completely incompatible with each other. But then what we're really interested in is making things better for the environment, reducing the impacts of life cycle of materials. And we're going to be using this law in quite a few ways to do that. Hopefully I'll have time to mention to that a little bit later. But one of the ways we're doing it, for instance, is making it so when the producers pay money into their producer responsibility organization, the producers who are producing good materials that are easy to recycle, don't cause problems, will end up paying less than the ones who are doing problem materials. They call it eco-modulation of the fees. And the intent is to give incentives to producers to take into account the end use of that material when they produce it, or take into account ways that they can reduce the impact of it by making it lighter or other sorts of ways to reduce the impact, because it will save them money in doing that. They want to pay these much fees as if they don't do that. So anyway, I've already mentioned this, that we're really putting a spotlight on advancing equity, including protecting the facility workers and bringing recycling to places that don't have it now, like a lot of multifamily don't have good recycling, or they might have some recycling, but it's just unmarked or very poorly labeled, and it's really not something they can use. hoping to have living wages for workers. A lot of things, these studies we're going to be doing for continuous improvement of the conditions for recycling, things to increase the equity. So just some key dates here. Believe me, this stuff is going to take a long time to happen. We have set goals in the statute that by 2025, by July 1st, 2025, the producer responsible organizations are supposed to have plans in place that we have approved and that are being operated. That's the implementation date. But we have to go through a couple sets of rulemakings before then. We have to tell the producer responsibility organizations what's supposed to be in the plans they're submitting to us. They're then supposed to produce those plans. They have to organize too. They have to, figure out who their members are going to be. There's going to be competition probably, but there might be one organization for the paper manufacturers. There might be another one for the plastics people. Who knows what, the aluminum people might have their own. We don't know what those organizations are going to do, but they definitely could have a number of different pros that end up having to do this. And then if we have multiple organizations, we're going to have to figure out how to get them all coordinated so that we have basically a single entity working. So this is all going to take a long time. The plans are due to us in 2024, and we are going to have them approved by July 1st of 2025 for these to be implemented in order to keep on the schedule that the law requires. So that's, wait a second here. What happened? Oh, there we go. I've mentioned a lot about Oregon laws. I wanted to talk a little bit about Washington laws. Washington has pretty much on the same schedule we have been, trying to develop and pass the same type of legislation we do. Unfortunately, it has not passed. It was the Renew Act. They had it in the legislature this year. It failed to pass. So there are still some things going on in the legislature, but that bill is dead for the year. Hopefully, they will bring it back next year. It's tied. It could be tied to, instance, they're bringing deposit legislation to Washington, which I think would be a good idea. Well, for those of you who don't know it, by the way, I lived in Seattle from 1974 to 1985, and I was a founding board member of a group that then was called Washington Citizens for Recycling, worked on some bottle bill issues. Now it's called Zero Waste Washington. And Zero Waste Washington is one of the prime sponsors of this legislation, like the Renew Act and a bunch of the things that I'm going to mention here. But Washington did pass a number of laws back in 2021 that we don't have here in Oregon. One is requiring minimum recycled content in bottles and in garbage bags, that by 2023, I believe it is, bottles are going to have 15% recycled plastic content in those bottles. And eventually it's going to climb to 50%. And when you have a recycled content mandate like that, what that means is that the producers have to figure out how they're going to get that recycled content into their bottles. And so they're going to be buying that plastic, and that's going to cause the price of plastic to go up and make it so that more material gets recycled. And garbage bags, initially starting out with 10% recycled content, eventually climbing to 20%. Another law was passed dealt with food serviceware, in that now, I believe this is already in effect, that no longer can restaurants automatically provide single-use plastic items such as utensils, straws, cold cup lids, condiment packaging, that sort of thing. Now they will need to ask you if, you'll need to tell them you want it instead of them simply putting it in the bag you're going to take out there. And hopefully that will really cut down in the amount of that is being produced, and cut down on the litter too, because fast food restaurants are one of the notorious sources of litter out there. And then they're going to be banning polystyrene products, like all those peanuts and so on that are made from expanded polystyrene, not polystyrene as a whole, but expanded polystyrene, what we call styrofoam, beginning in 2023. So again, Washington has some big laws that the Department of Ecology is working on getting implemented right now. They've been doing a bunch of studies. One of the things, though, that actually, let me just jump up to here. There's been, hold on a second. Yeah, I just want to mention on the recycled content. one of the things we've done is really look at data to figure out where it makes sense to do things and where it doesn't. And that's one of the things that I think recycled content laws in general are very good, but I think this one could have been better because it requires that bottles have recycled content. Bottles are things that commonly contain food. And if you're going to make something out of recycled content that contains food, you have to do a heck of a lot of processing on that plastic to make sure that it's safe, that doesn't have contaminants, that you don't have things like pesticide bottles that have gotten into the mix and they're going to get pesticides in the plastic and thus, eventually possibly into the foods that you're eating. So it takes a lot of energy and a lot of processing to take that plastic and turn it into a food grade material. What really makes more sense is to recycle that plastic into something that's a lot easier to recycle it into, such as drainage pipe. Drainage pipe, first of all, it's often black, which means you can use all sorts of different colors there. You don't have to just use clear stuff like you do with milk jugs. So you can have your Tide bottles and your Downy bottles and all those things go into making drainage pipe. The amount of processing you have to do is less, and that means, but in both cases, what you're doing is replacing virgin plastic, and you're placing equal amounts. In fact, even probably more in the case of the drainage pipe. So if I were to require recycled content, I would look at putting the recycled content on the things where it really makes sense to have the recycled content, like the drainage pipe or like strapping or textiles for PET plastic. And I wouldn't require it necessarily for the bottles that are out there. So one of the things that I mentioned about that I was a founding board member, Washington Citizens for Recycling, or now it's Zero Waste Washington. They switched their name. And there's one thing that they're doing that, again, I think a lot of it's good, but there's a problem with it. And that is they are pushing legislation that will require everything to be either reusable, all packaging to be reusable, recyclable, or compostable. And I'll talk a little bit about the reusable and recyclable. I think the reusable is fine, but I wanted to mention about the compostable, because composting is very good for natural materials, leaves, weeds, food waste, stuff like that. Composting is a really good thing to do. I don't think it's a good thing to do for artificial materials like plastics. You can make bioplastics out of corn. You can take corn and ferment it and form polylactic acid out of it eventually, and you make these bottles that look alike like the water bottles out of a polyester called polylactic acid. But when you stop and think about what that involves, you're going to have to grow a lot of corn. You're going to have to provide a lot of fertilizer for that. It's going to take up land that otherwise could be used for natural wildlife. And so there are real problems with that bioplastics there. But then even if you look at the end of life, people mistakenly think that you want things to degrade even if you throw it in a landfill. And that is actually not true. It's a complete mistake to think we want to have stuff biodegrade in landfills, because when stuff biodegrades in landfills, it produces methane gas, which is a potent greenhouse gas. And often it produces a lot of that in the first year you landfill it, which is before the landfills turn on their gas collection system. So that methane, you take something which is a carbohydrate, you make methane out of it, which is a greenhouse gas, which on a 20-year time frame is about 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide is. And methane is one of the major sources of global warming at the moment. And you put that methane into the air, and landfills are the third largest source of methane behind animal agriculture and leaks from the natural gas system. So, I mean, animal agriculture is the largest, and I have a whole talk on that, which probably a bunch of you have heard, but landfills are a major source of methane. And then they also produce organic acids as they decompose, and those organic acids can leach the heavy metals out of the electronics and the other garbage which is in the landfill, producing a very toxic leachate that has to be treated. And then finally, a lot of these bioplastics, even if you put them in compost, they don't produce compost. They provide energy to the pile, but it's like putting sugar in your pile. All it is, lactic acid is a very simple sugar. And so they will decompose completely to carbon dioxide and water, and you do not get the rich sort of humus that you get when you compost things like leaves and branches and that sort of stuff. So you're not getting any product out of this. So for me, to make everything be either reusable, recyclable, or biodegradable, or compostable, I should say, is a mistake, because the only thing I want to be composted are the natural fiber things like, again, yard debris. I don't think we should be composting things like polylactic acid. It'd be better to recycle if we had it. And one of the funny things we found from one of our studies is if you take food serviceware, you make it out of a biodegradable plastic, and then figure out what's the best thing to do with it, it isn't composting. It's actually landfilling that material, because polylactic acid doesn't degrade very fast in a landfill, and it stores that carbon away so it doesn't get into the atmosphere. So just a funny story there. And let me just do two last slides here. We have long had a hierarchy of reduce, reuse, recycle. But about a decade ago, I and one of my coworkers did research on this, and we found out that the hierarchy works really well at the top. Reduce, reuse, and recycle generally are the best things to do with stuff in that order. But when you get down to the bottom, the compost, recover energy, and dispose, the things that we're trying to avoid, it's not exactly in that order necessarily. It varies from material to material. I mentioned, for instance, the food serviceware made out of bioplastics, where the best thing to do isn't composting it. It's either recovering energy from it or it's disposing of it. That's better than composting it, because when you compost that, all you do is take all that carbon and put it back into the atmosphere with basically no benefit. So what we decided to do is switch our hierarchy to say the first thing you should do is look at the data. Figure out what will cause the minimum negative impact, and that's what you should choose to do. You shouldn't just go off of composting is better than disposal. You should look at the data and see if that's the case, and follow that. And if you don't have the data, then you drop back to the hierarchy. But even there, we have guidelines on what type of recycling is best. For instance, where mechanical recycling, where you simply chop something up and use it again, is far better than what they call chemical recycling or pyrolysis for plastics, where you go and change the entire molecular structure of the thing and produce a very toxic material in the process. So I mentioned before about the question of should all packaging be required to be reusable, recyclable, or compostable. I talked about compostable. I'll even talk why sometimes it's not best to have stuff be recyclable. And this is something you think someone would think it's heresy coming out of me, who's a very strong recycling advocate. But here's an interesting study. For those of you who are the age of many of us, we used to get coffee in steel cans. You remember, you had like the large number 10 cans or something like that. You buy your coffee in, and they might have a plastic lid that isn't recyclable, but that steel can was perfectly recyclable and continues to be recyclable in our curbside programs. Then we started seeing these large plastic tubs being used in their place. And those plastic containers are recyclable, at least in parts of the state. Portland metro area, I believe up there in Clark County. The lid might not be recyclable, but the body of it is. But now what we're seeing packaging being put in are these little non-recyclable flexible pouches. And you think those things aren't recyclable. And so if you have a requirement that everything be compostable, recyclable, reusable, you're going to have to say no to those plastic pouches. You can't use them. But what is the environmental impact of all of those based on the common recycling rates we use? For energy consumption, for instance, you can see that the flexible pouches use only about a quarter of the energy of the other two. For greenhouse gas emissions, they use a quarter to an eighth of what the others do. And then even on solid waste, because they are so light, because they use so little material, they produce less solid waste, even though 100% of them are being disposed, than those heavier materials that have a lower, they don't have 100% recycling rate. And even if they did, there'd still be residue from the recycling process. So what you get at is things that, if you look back to the hierarchy where reduce was at the top of the hierarchy, reducing things by making them really light, even if it makes them non-recyclable, is still probably the best thing to do. So I have a problem with requiring everything being recyclable or compostable. Green litter is a problem, and we have to take that into account. But here's an example where sometimes the non-recyclable thing is actually better because it uses so much less material, because you get that reduce aspect to it. So I think that's my last slide. Why don't we just open it up if there are questions? John, if you've got anything that's come up And I'll
Thank
stop
you,
my
Peter.
screen share.
Thank you, Peter. That was very good. At this point, if you have any kind of questions, let's go ahead and put them in chat or in Q&A, and we'll bring them up. In fact, looks like we have,
Deanna, I see one from Deanna. Large backlog in the city, that's finally getting cleared up. We had a problem with trucks not being able to go over the to the landfill in Eastern Oregon, the big Columbia Ridge landfill. We had a problem with a lot of the haulers and the facilities that run the transfer stations having workers out with COVID. They completely backed up at Metro Central. They had to eventually close it off to the public for a few days. They just held a big meeting, I think it was yesterday, no, it was today, doing the wrap up of we got through it, we're clearing out that backlog, what did we do right, what did we do wrong? So that's, so garbage is flowing again down here in the Portland metro area. So any other questions? I see there's a bunch of chats.
we've had a request if you could repost your contact information.
Sure, you can reach me actually just at peter@nwveg, northwestveg.org. That's the probably easiest way. I'm still active in the organization, and so if you want to reach me, that's probably the best way to do it. Email peter@nwveg.org. And anyway.
Okay, next question is, how might independent companies like Ridwell fit in?
Oh, Goodwill's it's okay. This is not going to be an official DEQ response. This is going to be personal opinion, but I'll give you some history because I've been around recycling since 1985 here in Oregon, and our Recycling Opportunity Act it was passed in '83, so I wasn't here for the passage, but it went into effect in July 1 of '86. So I've been involved in implementing it, and this is really back history, but the way we got our recycling law was that the garbage haulers suddenly realized that a Supreme Court decision threatened their ability to have garbage franchises. They needed a law from the state that specifically authorized them to have franchises where you have a single company has been given the right to pick up garbage in an area, and the government regulates their, what they can charge. And so they were really wanting to get the legislature to pass this sort of legislation. And the environmentalists said, sure, if you add recycling to your programs, we will support you in the franchising. And so that was the trade-off that was given. We'll give you the exclusive franchise for picking up garbage if you will do recycling programs. But that franchise covers anything basically which you charge to receive materials. And Ridwell is picking up materials that are hard to recycle, and they're only picking up small amounts, which means it's pretty expensive for them to go out there and pick this up. They have large costs that the garbage haulers don't have, because the garbage haulers they're only picking up the stuff that is more valuable, and they have the economies of scale being able to run down and pick up, household after household in these large trucks, whereas Ridwell has to go out there with a smaller truck and go up to everybody's house and open up the box and pull out the individual bags and so on. So Ridwell has to charge, and what that makes it is that the local governments can have franchises that would prohibit Ridwell from operating. But the local governments could also rewrite their laws to allow Ridwell, and Portland is doing that. They're allowing Ridwell to collect. Washington County is coming up with a system, I believe, I'm not sure, they haven't adopted this yet, but I think they're working on a system where the garbage haulers will be able to do the same sort of service that Ridwell does, sign people up as individual customers and do that. And so we could see competition between Ridwell and the local garbage haulers. Clackamas County, I think, is looking at just banning Ridwell from collecting. So we have different sort of responses. And my view is that I do not like seeing franchises where the garbage hauler says, I'm not going to provide this service, but you can't pick it up for recycling. I think that's really bad policy, but it is something which is allowed under state law. And the garbage haulers are very upset to see somebody coming in who's breaking their franchise, is their way of looking at it. So that's, again, my personal opinions on how this works. I would support, I mean, I think Widwell's a very, I think they think they're doing great stuff, and I think they are doing some good stuff. They're providing services that, you know, to recycle certain things that the public otherwise would have to drive long distances to do. You'd have to drive down to Tigard with your polystyrene, for instance. And then there's just some materials that we're both recycling that, you know, I don't think most of us would be able to figure out a way to recycle it. So that's my view on Widwell, and we'll see how it plays out over time.
Okay, the next question is, well, thank you for your presentation. Do you have an opinion about TerraCycle?
Do I have an opinion? TerraCycle is a company which will also take some very strange materials that are not standard, and they will recycle them. And I don't know that I want to offer an opinion at the moment. I will say that there are some potential issues. Recycling makes sense when it reduces environmental impacts. Generally, transportation is not a large thing, but if you are ending up having to send stuff back through the mail or something like that, and you're putting packaging on stuff to do that, it could be potentially that causes, you know, as much environmental harm as the savings you get out of recycling, or sometimes even more. And then there's some materials, like I know there's really a lot of effort now to make, by some of the companies that make things like toothpaste tubes, to make them out of one material so you can recycle them. But I'm not so sure that's a good idea, because how many people are going to clean out their toothpaste tube from all the paste that might be still in there and make it into a good, you know, clean material? And then how do you tell that tube from some other tube that isn't properly made and has, you know, multiple types of plastics that would make it so that it's non-recyclable? So I think TerraCycle is doing some good things, but I would want to see it, and they might have this, I'm not familiar with it. I'd want to see some what we call life cycle assessment data, some analysis of, are you actually providing environmental benefits for recycling this, or is it that the costs in terms of whatever packaging and whatever shipping costs exceed the value of recycling that stuff at the end? You know, maybe for some things like batteries, which are you know, very toxic and high energy, there might be some value, but I sort of want to look at it material by material and figure out what makes sense and what doesn't. So sorry, I can't answer the question. That's just one of those, but I can at least tell you some of the thoughts I have on what would be good and what it would be good, not good, and that.
Well, you may have already answered this one, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think the producers might end up partnering with companies like Ridwell to offer pickup for those harder to deal with materials? And what are your thoughts on Ridwell in general? And I think you've already answered that, but
well, I've answered the part on Ridwell in general, but I think it's all open as to what happens. I mentioned before about how we are going to expect that starting in 2025, or possibly a little bit later, we are going to see some materials which we call the producer collected materials. And I mentioned plastic bags as being one of those, which I believe is one of those materials that Ridwell collects. Polystyrene might be in that list. There might be a number of things in that list. And it could be that the producers will want to partner with things like Ridwell or James Recycling, or maybe some other company. Maybe they make their own company to provide collection services for those materials. Can't say at this point, because again, we're so early in the process. We don't even have an idea of who the producer responsibility organizations are going to be. We're sure they're talking among themselves trying to figure that out. But at this point, I can't say at all what they're going to do. That's up to them to figure out how they're going to organize and how they're going to meet the requirements of the law.
okay. Next is, why is it going to take so long to implement the new legislation? 2025 before the new system is working?
Yeah, well, that's, you know, when we were proposing it, the woman who was working, one of the women working on the project, sort of leading the project, actually proposed much shorter timelines. we are now looking, I mean, I'm now looking at, it is going to be really hard to get it implemented by that 2025 date, because we have to, first of all, adopt rules to say how this is going to happen. And if you know anything about the rule adoption process, that is a lengthy process. You have to get a team together. They have to look over the possibilities, come up with a proposal. Then you have to take that out to the public, get hearings on it, come back, maybe rewrite some stuff. We have to, pay for a number of contractors who are going to help us figure out some of these things, like what should be on that material list, the standard material list that I mentioned. We don't know for sure what is going to work or what isn't. We want to have the data to do that. But then the producers are going to be even more stressed, because they have to produce a plan that's going to be acceptable to us, but they won't know what our rules are until like 2023 and 2024. So they're going to have to be sort of guessing at our rules as they put together their plan and then submit it to us. And then we, the law gives certain requirements that we have so many days to review it, and then we can send it back for corrections, and they have so many days to do those corrections. And there are going to be public comment periods in each of those things, so that the public can weigh in and say what they think of the plans. There's a Oregon advisory committee which is supposed to be weighing in on this. I mean, yeah, it sounds like a lot of bureaucracy, and that's slowing stuff down. But it's something which we want to do this right. We have seen, we did it right in passage of the legislation. That's how we managed to do the legislation in one shot, as opposed to coming back year after year. But we want to make sure that we implement this thing right too. And we know we are going to be making some mistakes, but that's why we need to take the time to figure out what should be in those programs, how should they be operated, how can we make sure that the material is going to a responsible end market and not going to some place where it's going to cause environmental damage. So anyway, that's my answer on, it sounds like it's a long time, but it's going to be just a sprint for us to get the rules in place, and for the producers to form their organizations and get their plans in place and get those plans approved by us and get going.
Okay. The next one is there any progress on expanding yard debris, food compost opportunities in multifamily complexes?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know of anything on that. And unfortunately, that will not be covered under our current law. We're going to be working a lot on multifamily, but food waste is not a packaging, printed paper, or food serviceware. So we can't have the producers paying for that sort of work because it's not their material. So I don't know of any plans at this point. We are having a hard enough time getting recycling into those facilities, but it would be nice to have composting operations be able, for them to have some sort of bin there the residents could put their food waste in. But unfortunately, that's wishful thinking at the moment. It's not something which is in the plans for developing at this point.
Who are the producers?
They're companies like Procter & Gamble. They're companies that, we have exemptions for things like some of the restaurants who produce packaging when they give you your takeout stuff and so on. But the producer of that packaging is covered. So if you've got a paper bag manufacturing company, that's going to be a producer. It's whoever is putting the material into the package and then sending that package off, or in some cases, it goes a step back from that. And we have a whole hierarchy to figure out who is the producer who's responsible for paying for this stuff. Going back, sometimes it's as I mentioned before, it could be like directly a grocery store that's packaging their own material, could be a producer, but also the certainly the soft drink companies that, or I shouldn't say soft drink, like a winery that uses glass bottles could be a producer, although we gave us an exemption to the small wineries. But basically anybody who packages materials that you buy on the shelves There are some exceptions, like drug manufacturers are exempt, for instance. People who make both prescription and non-prescription drugs are their packaging is exempt from the law. There are things we just had to do in order to get the law passed because the lobbies were too strong to go against those. But I mentioned like a Procter and Gamble or those sorts of companies. Those are the main big producers who will be responsible for this. And some of them will have individual responsibilities. We're going to require the 25 largest producers to provide information on the environmental impacts of their packaging. They're going to have to provide, green light, open sourcing this sort of information so we can learn more about the environmental impacts of the packaging of these large companies.
Very good. How do you dispose of fluorescent light bulbs?
The best thing to do would be take it to a household hazardous waste facility. I believe that in the Portland metro area that the two metro transfer stations, Metro Central and Metro South, have that. Those who live in Clark County, I'm not sure, but I assume that you probably have a similar thing at your transfer station there. Maybe someone else can answer that, but I know that's where I would recommend here. And those are important to handle properly because those fluorescent tubes have mercury in them. And mercury is a very toxic chemical. You do not want to break those tubes. If you do break them, you want to be really careful cleaning them up and really bag this stuff up thoroughly because you don't want to have exposure to that mercury.
Okay, maybe a little outside your topic, but cremation is not as environmentally responsible. I heard about natural organic reduction. Yeah.
I'm going to go back to one of my heroes. Steve Apotheker was sort of, matter of fact, Steve and I were often sort of grouped together as the data people, the guys, he worked for Metro, I worked for the state. We both did recycling data a lot, but he was just an amazing guy. But unfortunately he had a disease that caused him to lose control of his body, and he died a number of years ago. Anybody who goes to Metro, the local government, as you go in there, you'll pass through the Steve Apotheker Memorial Plaza. And I actually gave a eulogy for him the legislature adopted a resolution regarding Steve Apotheker, and I got to give the main testimony on that thing. The reason why I'm mentioning that is because he chose to have a natural burial where he was just buried actually in his yard because he thought that was the best thing to do. I mean, I agree that cremation is, it produces that stuff up in the atmosphere, puts carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere. It's not the best thing. I think a natural burial would be much better. But that's my opinion. Other people have different opinions on it. But from an environmental standpoint, it's probably also not that huge of a thing because it's obviously something that only happens once in your life. So it's not good, but sort of as a symbolic thing. To me, it's much better than the standard methods of burial or cremation.
Okay, next, because of the new Oregon law, do you expect major companies to use new packaging so they can use the same packaging in all states?
Well, that is actually one of the problems that we have being Oregon as a small state. We want to have this like the eco-modulation of fees so that there's an incentive for companies to use packaging in Oregon that will reduce their fees. But to do that, they have to then, they really do need to probably do that nationwide. So if California joins us, if Washington joins us, it's going to make it a lot easier to convince companies to do something special to meet these new requirements. And that's why we have regular talks, by the way, with California and Washington and also British Columbia to try to match up what we're doing on these things. And of course, as I mentioned before, Washington had producer responsibility legislation. And I suspect they'll be looking at trying again next session, and hopefully they'll be looking at Oregon's, and we can hopefully match up some of these things better. So, so anyway, that's problem. We're too small of a state to have much of an impact, but hopefully other states will be joining us, and then that will have an impact.
Okay. Will Amazon be required to use recyclable materials under the new legislation?
Well, Amazon's going to be a major producer, that's for sure. They produce a lot of packaging. So will they be required to do recyclable material? No, actually, Oregon's law doesn't require things to be recyclable or compostable or reusable. We do require that it be properly managed at the end of life. And again, the reason why we didn't require it be recyclable is because sometimes being recyclable is not the best thing, as I showed in that case of the coffee. And we did a major study looking at, for instance, bags versus boxes for shipping material. Amazon, of course, used to use boxes a lot. Those bags are so much more efficient to use, whether they be paper bags or plastic bags. Both of them are just far more efficient than boxes. So again, Amazon will be a major producer. They will be spending money in Oregon to make sure that their materials and all their materials are dealt with properly. Being recyclable is not one of those things, but making sure that those materials have proper, for the recyclable ones have proper recycling outlets, and for the non-recyclable ones to, we're looking at hopefully expanding the law to cover litter, for instance. And if stuff gets littered, that the producers are going to be paying for that. That's not in the law. We had to drop that in order to get the law passed, but they put a provision in there requiring us to do a study and come back with recommendations on adding litter control to our bill. And that's a study, by the way, which I hope to do, although it might be a couple of years before I get to able to do it.
Good.
I think Fred Meyer and New Seasons accept plastic bags. Do they actually recycle them, or do they just dump them in the trash?
Well, I say yes, they do, because a lot of that plastic goes to a company called Trex that makes plastic decking. They make a mixture of plastic and wood fiber to make a decking material. And they are a major buyer of that. And not only do they make Trex out of it, their decking, they get so much plastic that they pelletize it up and sell it to other recyclers too. But that's where a lot of the film plastic recycled comes from. But to tell you the truth, what the public brings in is often smaller than what the store itself is producing. And the store's material is often a lot cleaner than what the public brings in. But still, the public stuff is added to it. And if you're making something like decking, that's a very forgiving use of material. If there's some contamination in there, it will sort of disappear into this thick deck material, unlike things like bottles where, some contamination can be a serious problem. So anyway, those Trex is a major buyer. We get reports from them through our material recovery survey that shows how many tons of plastic they recycle. I can't give the actual tonnage because that's confidential information under our law, but yes, the stuff gets recycled.
Is there a partisan lean on passing these recycling laws?
One thing nice about there might be somewhat of a partisan lean, but one thing nice about recycling is that conservatives like recycling too, because it's conservative, it's conserving things. And so we do get, when we pass our law, for instance, I'm not sure if we got any Republican votes this time, but I know that the state senator who represents Southeast Oregon, actually he has a huge district all the way from, Malheur County and Harney County, all the way up to the Dalles.
Wow.
Anyway, he although he ended up voting against it, he was actually very positive towards our stuff. And I think it was just sort of going along with the rest of the Republicans that he voted against it. But he was a very helpful person in helping form our law and at least giving it a decent hearing. So yeah, there is somewhat of a partisan thing going at this time. And, sometimes it's gone the other way. That our bottle bill was passed under a Republican administration, for instance. Tom McCall, for those who know Oregon history. And actually a lot of the Democrats opposed it. Some of the Democrats opposed it because they were representing the labor unions at like the glass manufacturers who thought they'd be losing jobs under the model bill. So these things have changed over time.
I think I can answer this next one. Great presentation and conversation, including the slides. Is there a way that we can watch the presentation again, or at least review the slides again? And yes, this is being recorded. It will take a while to do the processing, and then we will make that available to everybody that registered.
How do they access it?
That'll be automatically emailed to you when it's available so that you can access it. Tagging on to the latest question, we live in a retirement community. We might be interested in your presentation being done for this community. Do you do anything like this?
Yeah, I'm willing to. I know my agency doesn't want to have us doing too much of this because basically we have to, I mentioned before what we need to do to get this law implemented. I'm planning a major waste composition and recycling study right now. We're trying to get the request for proposal out, and that's going to be taking up a lot of my time. But I also really enjoy doing these presentations. It's fun, especially when I can have, unfortunately, we can't really do too much of a discussion here because it's of so many people. But, you know, I just did a presentation to a graduate class on circular economy offered at Columbia University. And that was a lot of fun for me to do, and being able to hear the questions directly and be able to do those things, you know, have that discussion with people. So I enjoy that sort of thing. So if somebody wants to send me, you know, arrange it, yeah, I'd be willing to go talk to a retirement community.
Okay. We may not have time for this, but one concern might be that some national or regional producers who have local presence may pull their operation from Oregon so they don't have to comply.
That's definitely a possibility. But I don't think that many of them will do that. You know, again, I don't think Procter & Gamble is going to decide not to sell any products into Oregon. I don't think Amazon's going to cut off shipping anything to Oregon based on our law. And by the way, I'll say a few words. The big companies know this is coming. They've dealt with this for years in Canada, in Europe, and they, in many cases, they're starting to support this. The New Seasons market was out there supporting this legislation, even though they're going to be a producer and they're going to be having to pay for this. You know, so and companies like Procter & Gamble and so on, they know about this stuff, and they want to make sure that it's done right when it's done, so that they might end up supporting nationwide legislation, so they don't have to deal with Maine's law separate from Oregon's law, separate from whatever Washington's going to produce, from whatever California's going to produce. There are multiple states looking at doing this type of legislation now. And the fact that Maine and Oregon have passed it is going to just be a bump ahead for New York and Connecticut and a lot of other states who are also looking at passing this type of legislation. And if we get a bunch of our states doing it, these companies are going to then ask for national legislation, because they won't have to, they want to be able to deal with one type of packaging that goes to the whole United States instead of having to deal with 50 individual state laws.
Very good. Okay, here's a comment for the listeners. IKEA also takes fluorescent bulbs.
Huh, I didn't know that.
Clark County takes hazardous waste on weekends at their transfer stations.
Okay.
Clark County transfer stations also take plastic bags. And then thank you, Peter and John. Well, I didn't do anything, so thank you, Peter. And a great presentation. And that ends all of the questions that we have right now.
Okay. Well, thanks. It's good to actually be able to see so many people and have a good, well-attended Northwest Veg event. Really do have to thank John for keeping this going and pushing, you know, doing this over the whole COVID era. And I think this shows that we can have a good, successful event like this.
Yes,
So thank you.
thank you.
And what I'm getting right now is a whole bunch of thank you, excellent presentation comments. So
Well,
like this
thanks.
one says, thanks, Peter. Always wonderful to hear your knowledge and expertise. So
Well, thank you all. It's good to see you all.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I didn't know you were doing events on Zoom until tonight.
Yeah, well, this is the Vancouver group's been doing it regularly. So, and this time we got it out to everybody too.
So thank you, everyone. Have a great week.
Okay.